The cabin door splintered under the force of the storm wind, and Sharon Hughes pressed her back against the far wall, clutching her rifle with trembling hands. Through the howling darkness beyond the broken threshold, she could see the silhouette of a man on horseback, motionless as stone despite the fury of the mountain tempest. Lightning illuminated his weathered face for a split second, revealing eyes that held neither threat nor comfort, only a weary recognition of shared desperation. Her husband had been dead 3 months now, taken by the fever that swept through the valley like wildfire through dry grass. The neighbors had stopped checking on her weeks ago, their own struggles consuming what little charity the harsh winter had left in their hearts. Now, with the worst storm of the season tearing across the peaks, she faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. Trust the stranger who had appeared like a ghost from the blizzard, or die alone in the ruins of her shattered sanctuary. The mountain man sat perfectly still on his horse, water streaming from his hat brim, his coat dark with moisture. He made no move to dismount, no gesture toward the rifle strapped to his saddle. He simply waited, as if he understood that the next few moments would require her decision alone. Behind him, the storm raged with biblical fury, transforming the familiar landscape into something alien and hostile. Sharon's finger found the trigger guard of her husband's old Winchester, the metal cold against her skin. She had learned to shoot during their first winter here, when Robert had insisted that survival demanded such knowledge. Now those lessons felt like prophecy fulfilled, though she had never imagined she would be pointing the weapon at a man who might be her salvation. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The stranger's horse shifted nervously, steam rising from its flanks in the frigid air. Still, the rider remained motionless, his gaze fixed on her face with an intensity that seemed to cut through the chaos of wind and rain. There was something in his expression that reminded her of Robert in his final days, a bone-deep weariness that spoke of battles fought and losses endured. Thunder crashed overhead, shaking the cabin's remaining timbers, and Sharon realized that her choice had already been made. Not by logic or calculation, but by the simple recognition of another human being pushed beyond the edge of endurance. She lowered the rifle slowly, her arms aching from the weight she had carried for far too long. 6 months earlier, when the first snows had begun to dust the high peaks, Sharon Hughes had been a different woman entirely. The cabin had been warm then, filled with the sounds of her husband's laughter and the crackle of seasoned wood in the stone fireplace. Robert Clark had built their home with his own hands, choosing this remote valley for its beauty and its promise of peace. They had been married only 2 years, but their love had the deep roots of a partnership forged in shared dreams and mutual respect. Robert worked the small mine he had staked just below the tree line, pulling enough silver from the mountain's depths to sustain their simple life. Sharon tended their garden and the handful of chickens they kept, learning to preserve food for the long winters and to find contentment in the rhythm of seasons. Their nearest neighbors, George Reed and his wife Elizabeth Miller, lived 5 miles down the valley, close enough for occasional visits, but far enough to preserve the solitude they both cherished. The first sign of trouble had come with the early frost in September. Robert's cough, which had started as nothing more than irritation from mine dust, began to deepen and persist. By October, when the aspen leaves turned gold and the mountain air carried the sharp promise of winter, he was spending more time in bed than at the mine face. Sharon tried every remedy she knew, brewing teas from pine needles and wild herbs, forcing him to eat despite his diminishing appetite. Elizabeth Miller rode up from the valley twice a week during those difficult months, bringing supplies and the comfort of another woman's presence. She had nursed her own husband through pneumonia years before and recognized the signs that Sharon was too frightened to acknowledge. The fever that came with November's first heavy snow was relentless, burning through Robert's body like fire through paper. Sharon barely slept during those final weeks, sitting beside their bed with cool cloths and whispered prayers. Robert would drift in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid enough to take her hand and speak of spring plans they both knew he would not see. Other times he wandered in delirium, calling out names from his childhood or speaking to people long dead. The end came on a bitter morning in December, when the wind howled down from the peaks with a sound like mourning. Robert opened his eyes one last time, focused on her face with perfect clarity, and whispered her name before the light faded from his gaze. Sharon held him until his body grew cold, then sat in the growing silence of their home, trying to understand how completely her world had changed in the space of a single breath. George Reed and Elizabeth Miller helped her bury Robert in the small cemetery beside the Valley Church, a simple service attended by the handful of families who had not yet fled to lower elevations for the winter. The words of comfort felt hollow against the enormity of her loss, but she accepted them with the same numb gratitude she showed for the casseroles and promises of help that would fade with the passing weeks. Winter settled over the valley like a living thing, patient and inexorable in its hunger. Sharon learned the weight of solitude in ways she had never imagined. The silence of the cabin pressing against her like a physical presence. She rationed the firewood Robert had cut, burning only enough to keep the pipes from freezing, and wore every layer of clothing she owned during the long dark hours before dawn. The mine remained sealed, its entrance marked by Robert's tools, which she could not bring herself to move. The silver that remained in the mountain's depths might as well have been on the moon for all the good it did her now. She had perhaps $50 in paper money hidden in a coffee tin, enough to last until spring if she was careful, but the isolation was proving more dangerous than poverty. Elizabeth Miller made the journey up from the valley whenever the weather permitted, but the storms came more frequently as January deepened, sometimes lasting for days at a time. During these periods, Sharon found herself talking to the chickens, to Robert's photograph, to the wind itself, desperate for any sound other than her own breathing and the settling of timbers in the cold. She began to understand why so many mountain widows simply disappeared during the hard months, found in spring thaws or not found at all. The temptation to walk out into a blizzard and let the cold take her was not madness, but a rational response to unbearable circumstances. Only the thought of Robert's disappointment kept her moving through the daily routines of survival. The loneliness was worse than the cold or hunger. She would catch herself setting 2 plates for dinner, or turning to share some small observation with a husband who was no longer there. The cabin felt too large and too small simultaneously, filled with memories that had become sources of pain rather than comfort. She took to sleeping in the kitchen, closer to the stove, abandoning the bedroom she had shared with Robert because the emptiness there threatened to swallow her entirely. February brought a brief thaw that turned the valley roads to impassable mud, cutting her off even from Elizabeth's irregular visits. Sharon spent those weeks in a haze of exhaustion and grief, maintaining the minimum routines necessary for survival while her spirits slowly eroded like snow in warm rain. She stopped looking in mirrors, stopped braiding her hair, stopped caring about anything beyond the next meal and the next night's sleep. The storm that would change everything began building on the first day of March, a towering wall of clouds that marched across the peaks like an advancing army. Sharon watched it approach from her kitchen window, noting the peculiar green tint to the sky that old-timers said meant serious weather. She brought the chickens into the lean-to attached to the cabin and secured everything that might blow away, then settled in to wait. Joshua Gray had been riding the high country for 3 days when the storm caught him, pushing his horse through passes that most men would not attempt in good weather. He was a mountain man in the truest sense, more comfortable in the wilderness than in any town, carrying everything he needed in his saddlebags and trusting his survival to skills learned through 20 years of solitary wandering. He had no destination beyond the next valley, no purpose other than the restless need to keep moving that had driven him since his discharge from the cavalry 5 years before. The war had left marks on his soul that civilization could not heal, but the mountains offered a kind of peace, demanding nothing from him but competence and endurance. He trapped when fur prices were good, guided hunting parties when he needed cash, and disappeared into the high wilderness when human company became unbearable. The storm struck with unusual violence, transforming familiar landmarks into alien shapes and turning the trail into a treacherous maze of hidden rocks and sudden drops. His horse, a sturdy mountain-bred gelding named Ranger, picked his way carefully through the blowing snow, trusting his rider's judgment even as visibility dropped to mere yards. Joshua had weathered countless such storms, but this one carried a malevolence that set his teeth on edge. As darkness fell, he began searching for shelter, knowing that spending the night in the open would likely prove fatal for both horse and rider. The wind had reached a howling pitch that made communication impossible, and the temperature was dropping fast enough that ice formed on his beard within minutes of exposure. Through the swirling chaos, he glimpsed a faint glow that might have been lamplight, though it could just as easily have been wishful thinking. Following the uncertain beacon, he guided Ranger down a treacherous slope toward what resolved into a small cabin, its windows glowing warmly against the storm's fury. The structure looked solid enough, built by someone who understood mountain weather, but there was something wrong with the scene that took him a moment to identify. No smoke rose from the chimney, and the light seemed too steady to come from a fire. As he approached, a gust of wind caught the cabin door and tore it from its hinges, revealing the interior in stark detail. A woman stood pressed against the far wall, holding a rifle with the desperate confidence of someone who had learned to depend on no one but herself. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, and her clothing spoke of months without concern for appearance. But her eyes held a fierce intelligence that the hardship had not diminished. Joshua remained motionless on his horse, understanding instinctively that any sudden movement would likely result in gunfire. He had encountered desperate people before, knew the particular tension that preceded violence born of fear rather than malice. The woman was clearly alone, clearly at the end of her resources, and clearly prepared to defend herself against any threat, real or imagined. The moment stretched between them like a taut wire, filled with calculations and possibilities that neither could fully articulate. Joshua saw in her face the same bone-deep weariness he carried, the look of someone who had endured more than should be humanly possible, and found the strength to continue anyway. She saw in his stillness a restraint that spoke of discipline rather than weakness, the patience of a man who understood that some situations required careful handling. The wind howled through the broken doorway with renewed fury, driving snow into the cabin's interior and threatening to extinguish the oil lamp that provided the room's only illumination. Sharon felt the cold air cut through her layers of clothing like a blade, but she kept the rifle steady despite her shaking hands. The stranger on horseback had not moved for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, his presence both threatening and oddly reassuring. Something in his stillness reminded her of Robert during his hunting days, that particular patience that came from understanding wild things and the importance of not startling them. The comparison brought a sharp pang of loss, but also a recognition that perhaps this man posed no immediate danger. His rifle remained in its scabbard, his hands visible on the reins, his posture suggesting exhaustion rather than aggression. A particularly violent gust of wind struck the cabin, and Sharon heard something tear loose from the roof with a sound like ripping canvas. The lamp flame guttered dangerously, and she realized that without the door to break the wind's force, the cabin would become uninhabitable within hours. The stranger seemed to reach the same conclusion, for he finally moved, swinging down from his horse with the careful movements of a man pushed to his limits. He led his horse to the side of the cabin that offered some protection from the wind, then approached the doorway slowly, his hands clearly visible. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible above the storm, but the words carried clearly in the brief lull between gusts. "Ma'am, I mean no harm. That door needs fixing, or we'll both freeze before morning." Sharon kept the rifle pointed at his chest, but found herself nodding slightly. The practical necessity of the situation was undeniable, and something in his tone suggested competence rather than threat. She watched as he examined the broken door frame, his movements economical and purposeful despite the obvious exhaustion that lined his face. "There's lumber in the lean-to," she said finally, her own voice hoarse from disuse. "Tools, too, if you know how to use them." Joshua Gray nodded once and moved toward the indicated structure, his boots crunching through the snow that had already begun to accumulate inside the cabin. Sharon followed his progress through the window, noting how he handled himself in the storm, the way he moved with deliberate care despite the wind's attempts to knock him off balance. He returned with an armload of boards and Robert's toolkit, setting to work immediately on a temporary barrier that would keep the worst of the weather outside. Sharon lowered the rifle slightly, though she kept it ready, watching as he measured and cut with the skill of someone accustomed to making necessary repairs under difficult conditions. The work took the better part of an hour, during which neither spoke beyond the occasional necessary instruction. Sharon found herself studying his profile in the lamp's flickering light, noting the lines that spoke of years spent outdoors and the particular kind of leanness that came from living on the edge of survival. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, and she realized that Robert would have approved of the craftsmanship. When the makeshift door was finally in place, the cabin's interior became noticeably warmer, though the wind continued to rattle the temporary barrier with persistent fury. Joshua stood back from his work, wiping sawdust from his hands, and for the first time since his arrival, Sharon felt the immediate threat of freezing to death begin to recede. The stranger had bought them both time, though what they would do with it remained unclear. "Your horse," Sharon said, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "He needs shelter." Joshua nodded, glancing toward the window where Ranger stood with his back to the wind, ice forming on his mane. "The lean-to. It's not much, but it's out of the wind. There's hay if you need it." She watched him disappear into the storm again, leading his horse toward the small structure that had served as Robert's workshop. The animal moved with the patient resignation of a creature accustomed to hardship, and Sharon felt an unexpected kinship with the beast. They were all refugees from the storm now, thrown together by circumstances beyond their control. When Joshua returned, stamping snow from his boots, Sharon had made a decision that surprised her. She had set the rifle aside and was stirring something in a pot on the stove, the first hot meal she had prepared for another person since Robert's death. The act felt strange and familiar simultaneously, a return to patterns of hospitality that had once been second nature. "It's not much," she said without turning around. "Bean soup and cornbread. But it's hot." Joshua removed his coat and hat, hanging them near the stove to dry. In the lamplight, Sharon could see him more clearly now, noting the premature gray in his hair and the deep lines around his eyes. He was younger than she had first thought, probably no more than 40, but he carried himself with the careful movements of someone who had learned not to waste energy on unnecessary gestures. They ate in silence, the only sounds the wind outside and the quiet scrape of spoons against bowls. Sharon found herself stealing glances at her unexpected guest, trying to reconcile his gentle handling of the meal with the aura of controlled danger she had sensed when he first appeared. There was something almost ceremonial about the way he ate, as if the simple act of sharing food carried significance beyond mere sustenance. "I'm Sharon Hughes," she said finally, the words feeling rusty in her mouth. "This was my husband's place." "Joshua Gray," he replied, setting down his spoon. "I'm sorry for your loss." The simple acknowledgement hit her harder than elaborate condolences would have. There was no false comfort in his words, no attempt to minimize her grief or offer empty reassurances about time healing all wounds. Just recognition of loss and the respect that such recognition deserved. "He died in December," she heard herself saying. "Fever. I've been alone since then." Joshua nodded slowly, understanding passing between them like a current. He had seen enough death to recognize its aftermath, the particular hollow look that came from being left behind. His own losses were different, but no less real, and he recognized in her the same stubborn refusal to surrender that had kept him moving through his own dark periods. The storm raged through the night with undiminished fury, rattling the cabin's windows and testing every joint in the temporary door. Sharon had offered Joshua the use of Robert's chair by the fire, while she settled on the kitchen stool with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The arrangement felt strange, but not uncomfortable, like a temporary truce between two armies that had discovered a common enemy. Sleep came fitfully for both of them, punctuated by the wind's howling and the occasional crash of something heavy striking the cabin's exterior walls. During the quiet moments between gusts, Sharon found herself listening to Joshua's breathing, the steady rhythm somehow reassuring after months of hearing only her own heartbeat in the darkness. She had forgotten how different a house felt with another person in it, the way shared space took on a different quality entirely. Dawn brought no relief from the storm, only a gray light that filtered through the snow-covered windows like illumination through frosted glass. Joshua was already awake when Sharon stirred, adding wood to the fire with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to early mornings. He had coffee brewing on the stove, the rich aroma filling the cabin with a warmth that went beyond mere temperature. "How long do these usually last?" he asked, handing her a cup of the steaming liquid. 3 days, sometimes 4, Sharon replied, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic. "This one feels different, though. Stronger." Joshua nodded, moving to the window to assess the conditions outside. The world beyond the glass had been transformed into an alien landscape of white, with familiar landmarks erased by the accumulating snow. His horse was barely visible in the lean-to, a dark shape against the pale backdrop, but appeared to be weathering the storm well enough. "We'll need more wood," he observed, noting the dwindling pile beside the fireplace. "And food, if this keeps up much longer." Sharon felt a familiar tightness in her chest at the mention of supplies. She had been rationing carefully since Robert's death, But her stores were not intended to feed two people through an extended storm. The mathematics of survival were unforgiving, and she found herself calculating how long their combined resources might last. "There's a root cellar," she said finally. "Potatoes, some preserved meat. It should be enough." Joshua seemed to sense the careful calculation behind her words, the way she was measuring their chances against the storm's duration. He had lived on the edge of survival long enough to recognize the particular tension that came from counting days against dwindling supplies. His own provisions were minimal, carried in saddlebags designed for mobility rather than extended stays. "I can hunt when this breaks," he offered. "There's usually game in the lower valleys, even after a storm like this." The promise carried weight beyond its practical implications. It suggested a future beyond the immediate crisis, a willingness to remain until circumstances improved. Sharon found herself considering the possibility that she might not face the remainder of winter alone, and the thought brought both relief and uncertainty. They spent the day in careful domesticity, sharing tasks and space with the awkward politeness of strangers thrown together by necessity. Joshua repaired a loose shutter and reinforced the temporary door, while Sharon mended a tear in his coat and prepared their simple meals. The work created a rhythm that felt almost normal, despite the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. By the second night, the artificial barriers between them had begun to erode under the pressure of shared survival. Sharon found herself telling Joshua about her life with Robert, the dreams they had shared, and the plans that would never come to fruition. He listened without offering advice or false comfort, simply bearing witness to her story with the patience of someone who understood that grief needed expression. In return, he spoke of his years in the mountains, the solitary existence that had become both refuge and prison. He told her about the war that had broken something inside him, the way civilization had become unbearable after witnessing what men could do to each other when the thin veneer of order was stripped away. The wilderness had offered healing of a sort, but it was a cold comfort that left him perpetually on the margins of human connection. "Why did you come up here?" Sharon asked as they sat before the fire, the storm still raging outside with undiminished intensity. In weather like this, most people would have found shelter in town. Joshua was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of long-held truths that were rarely shared. "I was running from something," he said. "Same as always. Thought maybe if I got high enough, cold enough, the demons might give up the chase." Sharon understood the impulse, had felt it herself during the darkest days after Robert's death, the desire to simply disappear, to walk into the wilderness and let it decide whether you lived or died. There was a terrible honesty in such surrender, a recognition that some burdens were too heavy to carry alone. "Did it work?" she asked. "For a while. But they always catch up eventually." The admission hung between them like smoke from the fire, visible but intangible. Sharon found herself studying his profile in the flickering light, seeing not the dangerous stranger who had appeared at her door, but a fellow survivor of circumstances that had pushed them both beyond the normal boundaries of human endurance. "Robert used to say that the mountains don't care about your troubles," she said. "They'll kill you just as quick whether you're happy or sad, rich or poor. But there's something honest about that. At least you know where you stand." Joshua nodded slowly, understanding the truth in her words. The wilderness was impartial in its cruelty, but also in its mercy. It offered no false promises or empty reassurances, only the stark reality of survival earned through competence and determination. There was a purity in that arrangement that civilization, with its complex web of obligations and expectations, could never match. The fire burned low as they talked, and Sharon found herself reluctant to end the conversation. It had been months since she had spoken to another adult about anything more substantial than the weather or the price of supplies. The simple act of sharing thoughts and memories felt like returning to life after a long period of merely existing. The third day brought a subtle change in the storm's character, the wind shifting direction and losing some of its earlier ferocity. Joshua noticed it first, his wilderness-trained senses picking up nuances that escaped Sharon's attention. He stood at the window for long minutes, reading signs in the movement of snow and the behavior of the wind that suggested the weather might finally be breaking. "Tomorrow, maybe," he said when Sharon asked about his assessment. "Or the day after. It's starting to weaken." The prospect of the storm's end brought mixed emotions for Sharon. Relief at the thought of surviving the crisis, but also anxiety about what would happen when Joshua continued on his journey. The cabin would feel even emptier after his departure, the silence more profound for having been temporarily broken. She found herself studying his movements with new attention, memorizing the way he handled tools and tended the fire, the careful efficiency of his gestures. There was something deeply reassuring about his competence, the way he approached each task with the confidence of someone who had learned to depend entirely on his own skills. "What will you do?" she asked as they prepared their evening meal. "When the storm breaks, I mean." Joshua paused in his stirring of the pot, considering the question that had been occupying his own thoughts. His original plan to push deeper into the mountains seemed less appealing now, the solitary existence that had once offered refuge beginning to feel more like exile. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "I was heading for the high country, but winter's not finished up there. Might be better to wait it out somewhere lower." Sharon felt her heart skip at the implied possibility, but forced herself not to read too much into his words. Joshua Gray was a wanderer by nature, someone who had chosen isolation over the complications of human connection. The storm had thrown them together by accident, not design, and she had no right to expect anything beyond temporary companionship. Still, she found herself considering what it might mean to have another person share the burden of surviving until spring. The practical advantages were obvious, but there were emotional considerations as well. The cabin felt more like a home with two people in it, the daily routines more purposeful when shared with someone who understood their necessity. That night, as the wind continued its assault on the makeshift door, Sharon lay awake thinking about the strange turns that life could take. 3 days ago, she had been resigned to facing the remainder of winter alone, counting down the days until spring with the grim determination of someone serving a sentence. Now she found herself imagining possibilities she had not dared to consider, ways that the future might hold more than mere survival. Joshua seemed equally restless, shifting in Robert's chair with the careful movements of someone trying not to disturb another's sleep. She wondered what thoughts occupied his mind, whether he too was reconsidering the path that had brought him to her door. The storm had changed them both, she realized, forcing them out of the isolation they had each chosen and into a connection neither had sought but both seemed to need. Dawn of the fourth day revealed a world transformed by the storm's passage. The wind had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a silence so profound it seemed to have weight. Snow lay piled against the cabin in drifts that reached nearly to the windows, and the familiar landscape had been sculpted into fantastic shapes that bore no resemblance to the terrain Sharon had known. Joshua was already outside when she woke, digging a path from the door to the lean-to, where his horse waited with patient endurance. Ranger appeared none the worse for his ordeal, greeting his master with the quiet affection of an animal that understood the bond forged by shared hardship. The sight of man and horse reunited brought Sharon an unexpected pang of loneliness, a reminder that she was still fundamentally alone despite the temporary companionship. The practical tasks of post-storm recovery occupied the morning hours. Joshua cleared snow from the cabin's roof, while Sharon checked their remaining supplies and assessed the damage to her small outbuildings. The chicken coop had survived intact, its occupants ruffled but unharmed, and the root cellar remained accessible despite the drifted snow around its entrance. By afternoon, the sun had emerged from behind the retreating clouds, transforming the snow-covered valley into a landscape of almost painful beauty. The light was so bright it hurt to look at directly, but Sharon found herself drawn to the windows again and again, marveling at the way the storm had remade her familiar world into something magical and strange. "It's beautiful," she said, finding Joshua standing beside her at the kitchen window. "And dangerous," he replied. But there was appreciation in his voice as well. "That much snow changes everything. Game trails, water sources, even the shape of the land itself." Sharon nodded, understanding that the storm's beauty came with a price. The deep snow would make travel treacherous for weeks, isolating her even more completely than before. The thought should have frightened her, but with Joshua's solid presence beside her, it felt more like a reprieve than a sentence. "You could stay," she said suddenly, the words escaping before she could consider their implications. "Until spring, I mean. There's room, and the work would be easier with two people." Joshua turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. Sharon felt heat rise in her cheeks, embarrassed by her boldness but unable to take back the invitation. The silence stretched between them, filled with possibilities and complications that neither had fully considered. "It wouldn't be proper," he said finally. "People talk." "What people?" Sharon gestured toward the snow-covered wilderness beyond the windows. "The nearest neighbor is 5 miles away, and they won't be traveling in this for weeks. By spring, it would just be how things are." The practical argument carried weight, but Sharon knew that propriety was not Joshua's real concern. He was a man accustomed to solitude, someone who had learned to depend only on himself. The prospect of extended human connection, even with someone who understood his need for space, represented a fundamental change in how he lived his life. The decision hung between them like morning mist, visible but not quite tangible. Joshua walked to the window and stared out at the transformed landscape, his hands clasped behind his back in an attitude of deep contemplation. Sharon watched him wrestle with considerations she could only guess at, the internal debate between isolation and connection that had probably been raging in his mind since the storm brought them together. "I'm not easy company," he said without turning around. "I've been alone too long, forgotten how to be around people." "I'm not people," Sharon replied. "I'm just someone who doesn't want to face another winter alone." The simple honesty of her statement seemed to reach him in a way that elaborate arguments could not. Joshua turned from the window, and Sharon saw something shift in his expression, a subtle relaxation of the barriers he had maintained since his arrival. For the first time, she glimpsed the man he might have been before the war, and the wilderness had carved away everything but the essential core of survival. "There would have to be rules," he said. "Boundaries. I'm not looking for anything complicated." Sharon nodded, understanding that he was offering her a practical arrangement rather than a romantic one. The distinction was important, allowing them both to maintain the emotional distance necessary for such an unconventional situation. They were two damaged people seeking mutual benefit, not lovers or even friends in any traditional sense. "Separate sleeping arrangements," she said. "Shared work and expenses. No expectations beyond making it through to spring. And then we see where we stand." Joshua considered this for a long moment, weighing the proposal against his deeply ingrained habits of solitude. The storm had shown him something he had not expected to find, a glimpse of what life might be like with another person who understood the value of silence and the necessity of hard work. Sharon Hughes was not asking him to change who he was, only to share the burden of surviving until the world became navigable again. "All right," he said finally. "Until spring." The agreement sealed something between them that was more binding than any formal contract. They had chosen each other, not out of love or desire, but out of the practical recognition that some challenges were better faced together than alone. It was a partnership born of necessity and mutual respect, the kind of alliance that had allowed humans to survive in harsh places since the beginning of time. Outside, the sun continued its work of transforming the storm's aftermath into something beautiful and strange. The valley lay pristine under its blanket of snow, unmarked by any sign of human passage save the thin line of smoke rising from their chimney. It was a landscape that demanded respect and offered no easy answers. But for the first time in months, Sharon felt equal to its challenges. Joshua Gray had ridden through the storm, seeking nothing more than shelter, but he had found something far more valuable. In the warmth of Sharon's cabin and the quiet strength of her character, he had discovered that isolation was not the only path to peace. Some demons, he realized, could only be faced with another person standing beside you. Someone who understood that survival was not just about staying alive, but about finding reasons to want to keep living. The mountain man had indeed found the widow who would change his life forever, though neither of them fully understood the transformation that had already begun. Spring was still months away, but for the first time since Robert's death, Sharon Hughes could imagine a future that held more than mere endurance. And for the first time since the war, Joshua Gray could envision a life that included another person without losing the essential solitude that had become his salvation. The storm had passed, but its work was complete. Two people who had thought themselves beyond the reach of human connection had found each other in the wilderness, and in doing so, had discovered that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in facing the darkness alone, but in allowing another person to share the burden of carrying light into the shadows.